Today I'm going to be talking to Saiyan KCM on YouTube, also known as Scott. Welcome, sir, to the No Frauds Club. You are a content creator, broadcaster, StarCraft head, if you want to call it that, Brood War head, maybe more specifically, who's been around for quite a while doing all manners of different broadcasting, and most recently you just sat down another season of the KCM Race Survivor series. It's something that I think we're going to talk about it later on in this show is definitely related to, the broadcast side of it. But before we even get into the more nitty gritty stuff, I just wanted to ask you a more broad level question to sort of get where you're coming from when it comes to why you're so dedicated to Brood War specifically. And I obviously am somebody who comes very heavily from the Brood War background. Do you believe that StarCraft Brood War is the greatest RTS we've seen so far? And what do you think is so timeless about it in some ways?
Yeah. What can be said about Brood War here? I mean, it is definitely the greatest RTS of all time, in my opinion. It's really withstood the test of time, like you were saying. It's 25 years old, going on 26 years now, and it's it's a combination of a bunch of different things. I think the sound design is from another era, where sound design wasn't so manufactured and taken so seriously. I think that the small team at Blizzard at the time of making StarCraft Brood War uh, gave them a lot of restrictions, but having extra restrictions on your time and the inputs that you've got, the money, the amount of manpower that you have can actually be beneficial in a lot of ways for creating things like solid game, like a gameplay loop or a gameplay system. Even though it sounds counterintuitive, but in a lot of cases, the things that you know people and developers want to have, huge budgets and massive teams, sometimes those can actually get in the way of creating something kind of special. And I think that they really they hit on like a really special note with Brood War that I don't think has been replicated since.
Okay, so some of it is, from things from another age. You do well to point out that it's going to be 26 years old. There are so few games out there that are still actively being played and approached from a competitive standpoint, no less, that are a quarter of a century old by now. So that's a crazy stat on its face. I got to agree with you about the sound. That's something that not very many people bring up, but I think that one thing you can say is that, and maybe this is partially due to a lot of the patches that have happened in StarCraft 2. And of course, you made a very, I would say, seminal video where a lot of people may know you from on the differences, how StarCraft 2 is sort of floundering in its current competitive space, while Brood War is, enduring the test of time, like you
Mm.
said. And so, that's a video that I think many people should take a look at, just if they haven't seen it somehow, because I feel like it's made the rounds by now. But definitely a video that goes into the details about the differences in why those two titles didn't work, and not to necessarily always specifically mention the sequel, because it is almost like the black sheep if you're a Brood War guy, and then if you're a StarCraft 2 guy, then you think the Brood War guys are like out of their mind, just to always bringing up the
Mm.
old game. So it can be almost polarizing in some ways, but I would say, just looking at it, like, I definitely think that Brood War is the better game, and I actually have a very low opinion of StarCraft 2. But one of the things, if we're just talking about the audio, is that I've listened to it and watched a lot of StarCraft 1 and 2 pro games and streams. And if I have a Brood War stream on in the background, I can tell you basically what's happening just from the audio, right? Like, it's kind of crazy to
Right.
think about that. Whereas in the StarCraft 2 case, there's not more things happening. I mean, maybe there's like
Mm.
faster fights, but the same number of units mostly in the game, a lot of the same upgrades and abilities and counts and stuff. It's not really
Yeah.
that much more complex of a game in terms of the raw things that are going on, but you can't necessarily like zero in on exactly what is happening based on the audio alone, I've found. And so it's funny because I was just thinking about this earlier yesterday, because I had a StarCraft 2 stream open and a Brood War stream open, and it was so much easier for me to figure out what was going on in one versus the other. So it's funny that you wound up bringing that up as one of the points. And I do think it makes a non-trivial difference. Like, sure, you can have a game that doesn't have great audio, but maybe that game doesn't last as long as the game that does, right? It's like a win
Mm.
more type of thing, but for game design, you think?
Yeah, and just thinking about it more deeply, I guess the reason that the thing that makes the audio great and what also makes the graphics great and what makes the gameplay great as well is really the grittiness. I
Yes.
feel like that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, it's a great point because one of the things I've always preferred about the Brood War aesthetic, if you will, even before the remaster, like I actually prefer. I'm so boomer. I prefer the old graphics over the remaster. I know some people think that the remaster is just a superior coat of paint. For me, I like a lot of the classic stuff, and I do think that there's an element to it where it ages a lot better than a more cartoony style or a more stylized approach to graphics, and that's I always thought that Brood War looked better than, for example, like Warcraft 3 or something like that, right? And that's, forget about the
Mm.
game design, forget about the gameplay. It's just, oh, what actually looks better visually? Well, that one has stood the test of time more. So it's kind of interesting too, as another way to think about it. And the fact that we both agree that Brood War is the best RTS we've seen so far means that we can now get into what I think is like a really interesting standpoint. Is we've both watched this game develop, we've watched the metagame unfold in a very different way in the post remastered era than what we had before,
Hmm.
where we say very different way. It's not like we're building ghosts or scouts, but we are still seeing a very significant change in terms of like the build orders. There's certain things that are more meta now due to the lower turn rate, like Mutalisk Micros like leveled up massively, and all this other more fine tuned stuff. And yet, one of the things I always think about for Brood War, because I'm trying to learn from it so that I can do better in my own games, or at the very least do a good job in my own games, even if I can't, usurp the top dog in my first attempt through, is how can we learn from Brood War? What can we learn from it and like take into it? And that's where I think this video that you made comparing Brood War to StarCraft 2 does actually do a really good job of explaining, like, yeah, there's a game that came out that was supposed to be the sequel, that was supposed to maybe learn some lessons, and they made their own set of mistakes, and those maybe brought back to bite them. So could you speak a little bit on sort of what inspired you to make that particular video and what your breakdown of Brood War versus StarCraft 2 is?
Yeah, I heard the news about StarCraft 2 and the whole thing about the Blizzard pulling out a bunch of funding, like they were gonna cut massively their funding for all these tournaments, and I was thinking, wow, I didn't even know that they were funding those. And I mean, Brood War never got that funding. Look at Brood War, it's still going strong, still, kicking along 25, 26 years later. So I was just really shocked to see, how much of a push that Blizzard had given to StarCraft 2. And I mean, StarCraft 2's had its day in the sun. It's had a huge amount of success on Twitch and, throughout the gaming sphere. It's had a massive impact. And I don't want to, you know, take away from that, but I just feel like Brood War is more enduring because of what reason. So I tried to really break that down and like think about it really clearly. And my the reasons that I came up with was basically the sound design is not as gritty. The video like the type of graphics are not as gritty, and basically the design was too fluid. They're continuously changing all the time and not allowing the pro gamers and the gamers who love the game to kind of adapt to the new changes before they're suddenly changing something else because of complaints or that sort of always online live update live service model that's been so pervasive now. And I thought that, what, this deserves a video. This is something that I think a lot of companies are making this mistake, that people really, they think that they want to have always updating live service games because it keeps things fresh. But in the end, I think that games can benefit from, and especially RTS games can benefit from just some time to ruminate and let people figure out what's the best way to do things.
Yeah, you almost need time for the meta to develop in the first place. Just
Mm.
one of the things I've learned is building my own RTS projects. And we have a sort of prototype in the works that we've been doing, little tournaments for here and there and stuff. And it's supposed to be like, oh, here's what we might do with the RTS genre that's very different, but still learning from the past. And we have been running these competitive events. We've been trying to do, videos of me casting like the games and stuff and showing the project off. But the main thing that I always am curious about is how people react to a strategy unfolding, because you kind of almost have to turn down the noise level on the public feedback that you get. Like it's good to interpret that if you're in the designer's shoes. This would be like all of the posts on the Blizzard forums back in the day for StarCraft 2 about how, a certain thing is really powerful or whatever. If you turn down the noise on that, or you set that to one side, but then you watch the players responding to that event, you'll see something unfold. Like the example that I gave is that in our project, we had Protoss winning the early game versus Zerg really heavily, and then without any balance changes targeting the early game, Zerg started winning because there's a player who'd innovated a strategy to get advantages in the early game, and then that got adopted rather by all of the higher level players that like saw that and were like, oh wait, this might be a thing. And it's like just that alone, I mean, and that mirrors so many different meta developments in other games. I'm not saying it's unique, but just like the idea of like, oh, seeing that back and forth with no balance changes from the designer, no decree from high up saying, okay, now we have to correct this issue because Zerg are struggling. It turns out, well, maybe Protoss struggled more than Zerg did once you figured out certain details. And so having details like that, it's like that is sort of the I guess the poison chalice of having that live service model that you're saying is that you'll get tempted to immediately respond to some feedback, especially if it's very like voiced, I guess, like very negatively. If you get like a fever pitch from people on the forums or on, wherever your community managers are and stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay. And, if somebody's posting in our smaller community and they're like really angry or worked up about something, yeah, that feels bad. But if you respond by immediately knee jerk changing something, you can, rob the rest of your players of something magical, which is really just the I guess like the meta level skill, like literally meta level of looking at a problem and thinking, how can I solve this without, like on a strategic level, like what can I do differently that will give me an advantage? And I feel like that is, if you're following a game for long enough, is like the most interesting thing about the meta for me is like, okay, like, in ASL level players, we had, forward rack start to be really, really powerful versus Zerg. So how do Zergs respond to that? And then of course there was the whole like Academy Rush where that was in vogue. And now it's like, okay, now it becomes more normalized because like there's this flow chart of things that you can do in response to it if you know that it's coming. And instead of it just being like a decided win, and it starts off maybe feeling really powerful, but then, you figure out a way. And then like maybe the ultimate parachute for Brood War, since it isn't getting any more patches, is just like, okay, a map pool change comes in and that makes the strategy less powerful, right? But like the fact that they couldn't knee-jerk react meant that, like, compared that to StarCraft 2, where they did change a lot of stuff almost like felt like every other week or whatever, it can be pretty difficult, right, for the pros to scale up. And like you're saying, I guess like this is probably, do you agree with me, or do you have a similar opinion that one of the most important things about a game's longevity is seeing the meta evolve like almost organically, if that makes sense? Or like, how do you think about that? Because that's definitely a call sign of Brood War, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know. We've seen that StarCraft 2 is still doing okay. Like it's not dead or anything. It's doing fine. I put in my title that Blizzard kind of killed their own game. I mean, they really did just throw them under the bus basically by getting rid of all of their tournament support. But it's still doing fine. It's just not personally the thing that I like to see, right? Like what I hate personally as a player and as a caster and a viewer of the game is like just watching or being a part of the meta shift where like, oh, let's look at the patch notes and see what's more popular now. Let's see what's going to be strong in this patch. And then everyone just trying to adapt to the latest patch and not really thinking of like those type of things, what you're talking about, of like, oh, here's this strategy that's out of the box thinking that we can actually implement to change the meta game ourselves. Instead, it's always just, okay, we've got this metagame. There's been a change. Reaper is now stronger. I'm going to start massing Reaper, or, now Reapers are in, or now, dropships are stronger, and now this is strong. That type of thing, that sort of like chasing the developer or the coding of the game, the changes, the latest patch is super annoying to me. It's very like, it's really not fun in my opinion, and it also takes away a lot from the viewers who aren't following the meta and not following the patches, because they're just like, looking at like, why are they doing that strategy that, when I played the game that didn't work, and like, why is it working now? And and they're like, oh well, this patch happened and that patch, it's strange to see. And when they try to come back to the game, that's totally different. It's I don't think it's good for an RTS. I think it works okay for something like a MOBA, like League of Legends or whatever, where they're constantly patching everything. But I still don't think it's healthy for like the longevity of a great game.
Yeah, I would say I was actually thinking of League when you were explaining, the whole idea of like constantly changing it, and then now the pros are doing different things, and there's like, I mean, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that there are people among the professional teams of certain MOBA teams that are like they're analysts, but they specifically every time a patch comes out are the ones doing number crunches and stuff. Like they've been
Mm,
paid to study the patch notes of a game, which just sounds a little whack to me. Like I guess it's cool
yeah.
in some ways, but it's like this actually does change things. And I followed professional league for a good while, way back. Like we're talking, I don't know, probably 8 years ago now. But the one of the things I noticed I was able to track is that like certain players would basically the player themselves would receive a direct nerf from some interaction happening where like maybe their
Hmm.
champions got nerfed or maybe the meta started to favor tanks instead of bruisers or whatever, and so like different roles. And then okay, well suddenly you might make a signing for your esports team and you're thinking, yeah, I'm gonna get this like really good powerful stud top laner who's gonna do a lot of damage in the early game and stuff, win lane, and that can be a shrewd move, and then like the balance can come in and change it, and now that's okay, well actually you need a tank or something instead, a guy who can play tanks
Right.
well. So even on that level, I feel like it can almost invalidate careers, or at the very least, like reduce the significance of an individual, I guess. And I mean, it's a team
Mm.
game, so maybe that's why it doesn't matter as much. But in a 1v1 game, like the individual is what matters. And so I feel like maybe that's another reason why I personally rub up against that negatively and say like, whoa, wait, hold on, you can't just completely overhaul and change somebody if they're like using this unit to great success, and then you rework the whole unit or whatever. There's a number of times where they tried to massively change and overhaul like the infestor and stuff, for example. And
Right.
when you're in situations like that, it's like, okay, well, what if I'm, regardless of whether or not it's really powerful, what if I'm just really good at using that unit, and then suddenly like the skill of the game becomes adapting to patch notes or patches, like you were saying, and less about playing the game, I guess. And would you say that's like a fair characterization of what you saw a lot in StarCraft 2?
Yeah, I think so. And I just can't imagine if they do that in Brood War, like, oh, Snow is really good with Reavers. Let's just nerf the Reaver, and like, yeah, that just seems so crazy to me. Like, Terran players they have to figure it out, They have to find a way, and that's what they've always done. And that it's just a matter of time before they start getting to the next level. That's how I always feel, is not that the players are hopping on the bandwagon of each patch, is that they really have to level up every time a new strategy comes. Like, the players, they just continuously get better and better and better and better. And players who are good now, even if they were like, they're moderately good now, would just blast anyone from 10 years ago. You know what I mean? Because they're just so much better. And I don't think that is something that kind of translates to StarCraft 2. I don't really know. And the thing is, we can't really tell because the game is so different, right? Like, the game in Brood War is still the same, so you can look at it and go like, wow, these players are so much better than the ones from the past, because you can see the difference, you know what I mean? And the game is still exactly the same. So I think that's a huge thing. I named it, or I said it in my video. It's like legacy of the game is massive as well.
Right. And I mean, it's I guess this is an interesting side tangent to go down too, is the idea of like, okay, if you're going to have a game that has this legacy that you're talking about, this level of importance put on the like learning and understanding the meta and understanding how the game works, and that understanding isn't going to change depending on which year you're playing in. It's just a question of what are the in vogue strategies and what can still work. Do you agree then that with the claim that I've heard recently that StarCraft One is actually like the game where it takes the longest to get to a professional tier level in? Because it's really funny when I hear people who obviously like as broadcasters we're always trying to tell narratives to the community and get them picked up on stuff. and I've heard people say like, "Oh, this guy's new," and I'm like, "Wait, didn't I see him like 3 ASLs ago?" And it's like, yeah, but like
Mm.
he's still new. Like 2 or a year and a
Right.
half or whatever of top level play is still like you've only just scratched the surface compared to some of these people. Like Jaedong is still playing now. Like that's crazy. So
Hmm.
like, do you reckon that it's true in that sense that like no matter really how good baseline you are, you still need to do a lot of grinding to understand details about the game like that?
Oh yeah. Well, we haven't had any like new, really young new people come in for a long, like it's been a long time, but you got to think back to the players like Flash who came in when he was 15 and started winning tournaments, right? It's not impossible to come in as a new player and learn the game and do really well. I mean, the skill level is different now than it was in 2007, 2008, but the I mean, that's still really really impressive to come in as a 15-year-old and crush in this game that's been out for this long. But um yeah, it is super duper hard. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it at all for anyone who's thinking about picking up the game. It is insanely difficult to get into, but I think there's been a few success stories. Even like most recently, I think TY came back from StarCraft 2, and he's been playing Brood War for a long time. He started out in Brood War as baby before he went to StarCraft 2, but like he hasn't played for years and years, and now he's already back in the ASL. I think he's been practicing for maybe half a year, or something like that. So it's possible. There are some transferable skills there, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think when you need to dedicate as much time that you need to be a top level professional player at anything, if it's StarCraft 2, there's definitely going to be some transferable stuff. We've actually gotten, like, just as a bit of a side note, we've got like there's a high level ladder player in StarCraft 2 that also plays our project, and pretty quickly he was able to compete with the top guys just because the skills that you need to be a top level ladder player, like a high grandmaster or whatever, are despite the fact that the games are very different, and you still you have like a baseline foundational understanding that you can kind of level up, right? And so you just spam games out and understand the theory behind things, then you don't get knowledge checked as much by players who are mechanically weaker than you, and then suddenly you're good to go. And so I feel like it's hard to say that it's interesting, I guess, to me that like the whole idea of some of the StarCraft 2 players coming over to Brood War is another thing you covered in your video, is that there's a bunch of people who were playing StarCraft 2 and now have switched back to Brood War. And I mean, I guess it's probably like, maybe you can speak to this whether you agree with it or not, but my current understanding of it is StarCraft 2 is a bit more like Western focused or a bit more mixed maybe, and then the foreign scene in Brood War is comparatively smaller than StarCraft 2's foreign scene, but the Korean scene is way bigger in Brood War. That's what it seems like to me. And so you're getting a lot of like what were the historical highest level players in StarCraft 2, or the most winningest players in StarCraft 2 switch over. We got Mind and stuff like that too coming back, and so it feels like there's certain people that are, when you're watching that, if you have had any cross pollination where you've seen games like you obviously referenced Baby, and it's like you've seen people come back in and play and practice up, and however long they've been there doing that. Obviously, Jaedong himself was in StarCraft 2 for a little bit too, and so I don't know. It's interesting to me to think about like that transfer of skills, and it does seem like you're getting a lot more people over there. Has that continued to be true in your estimation? The idea of like shifting over to a much more Korean focused Brood War in after the remaster?
Well, it's an interesting topic because there's been a lot of different players. MC has come back recently. Um, there's just been waves after waves. Of course, Flash used to play in StarCraft 2 too, and there was Soul Key, who was a champion in StarCraft 2 for a long time. He's now a champion in ASL as well. Um, these players, I think they're going to keep coming back because there's actually more money to be made in StarCraft 1 now. Um, with the removal of the prize pools from by Blizzard, and the sort of, a lot of the crowdfunding is still there to help people out, but the thing is that tournaments are not as big of a cash flow for these players as you might think, right? Like there's these massive prizes. Some of them are, close to $1 million for a prize that is not a guarantee if you're going to be playing at the highest level, right? You're probably, maybe if you're one of the best players in the world, someone like TY or someone like Maru or something, you can probably guarantee top 5, right? But it's very hard to guarantee a win. And these days, most of the money that's being made by StarCraft professionals is actually through streaming. And it's kind of been the driving force behind streaming in Twitch was StarCraft 2, but StarCraft Brood War is really blown up on Korean streaming platforms and is on Twitch as well. And they've started something called the Pro League. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the Daily Pro League has really exploded recently. I'm doing a video about it. That's going to be my next video coming out soon. We've seen them earn upwards of $30,000 in a single day in the Pro League. So they're making more money than in an ASL. So it's quite insane. So what they do is they get 5 players together, and all of them are streaming at the same time. And the streaming scene is huge in Korea for Brood War, and so all the pro players stream, and so one of them will start a pro league and set a buy-in amount and call on all the other pro players who are streaming to try to buy in as well. So they all ask for donations towards their buy-in, and then they pool the money all together and split themselves into 2 teams of 5 randomly using a random number generator. And then the 2 randomly selected teams go in this long series of best of ones that's like 20 games long. There's like a really complicated setup to how it works. And then whoever comes out on top in the end splits the prize pool between their whole team evenly. So all 5 players get a payout, and the other 5 players who lost get nothing. It's like you get like a 50-50 chance basically of a big payout, and the viewers get like a great viewing experience where all the players are playing their hearts out for thousands of dollars that's on the line. So it's almost like an ASL day every single time these guys are playing. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it's a huge undertaking from a sense of like organizing that, but it's really cool to hear that there's like this scene sort of blossoming, or has been blossoming for a while now, the whole streaming sector. Obviously some people might be familiar with the fact that Twitch pulled out of Korea recently, and that was its own whole other thing. But the fact that they have their own providers for that sort of thing, and they can still stream, and they do have, I mean, they were never, the sad thing was I felt like they were almost just now starting to start streaming on Western platforms, so we could get a little bit of a, oh yeah, here's Snow on Twitch, and here's whoever on, and you get to like pop in there and see what's going on, and then they pull the plug because of the costs or whatever, and so that is sad, that is unfortunate, but I don't honestly like it from an outside perspective. Now that it's been a little bit of time since then, it doesn't seem to have really hurt, the Korean players at all. If anything, it just kind of makes them a little bit more isolated from us foreigners, right? And that seems to be the only end result. But you can still go and watch their streams if you want to. There's like ways to do it. So it's just made it a little bit less, I guess, a little bit more opaque, harder to pierce. But while we're on the subject of difficulty and understanding that, like, okay, StarCraft 2 players are coming in, and it's not impossible that they could be, good players overall from a standpoint of like what we saw Baby do, or TY as he's now known. And it's like, okay, there's definitely an aspect to this that's difficult. It does take a while to get into it. I want to talk to you about the design that goes into Brood War and how, like another sort of echoing something that we said earlier about the whole live design. Something else that you can do using the live service stuff or patching a lot is fix bugs. And imagine Brood War without the bugs. Like, the bugs are basically half the features at this point that are used. You think about, stuff that was not necessarily intended even. Like, I don't know if you'd call it a bug, that the whole magic boxing interaction, but that was definitely not something that Blizzard was designing around when they were making the game. So it's, I always try to use that too as an analogy of like something that emerges really cool, because it's thematically appropriate that like a bunch of the organic Zerg units would merge together into one sort of many-headed hydra, if you will, and like stack together and
Right.
be almost like one thing. So it's very interesting that that worked out. And technically it can happen with wraiths too, but that's much more rare in the pro level. So the fact that that's like the commonality there, or the common course for that, is really cool. But even beyond that, like all the bugs are there, all these little quirks, all the ways that the units decide to misbehave, or okay, sure,
Mhm.
I'll follow that order, but I'll go slightly differently than where you wanted me to, and screw everything up, and all these cascading effects. There's a school of thought that says if you make the game more permissive, if you make the game more, smooth in some ways, more clean, maybe more fluid, like the idea of it being something that gives you more structure to more like concrete expectations of what you can do, and doesn't tax your focus as much to do things like ordering units up a ramp, or, building your structures. You have to like, move all your workers out of the way so you can put this missile turret down, as Terran, instead of being able to just place it down like you can in StarCraft 2. And some of these things, we ourselves have moved away from in our own work, but there's definitely some of these things that I think like you when you move away from that, you can't just move away from that in the name of accessibility, in my opinion. Like my perspective is you have to understand what you're removing. Like even though maybe it's
Mm.
clunky, maybe it's difficult, like in the Brood War case, there's still something it's added. Could you speak a little bit on your perspective on what is added to Brood War by all of its like difficulty and clunkiness?
Well, there's really a lot of like you were saying, emergent sort of mechanics that can be utilized to a player's advantage. Uh, if you're similar in skill to the other person, if you're really good at micro, if you're very good at macro, your strategy, your game sense is pretty on par, but you're able to utilize these small emergent strategies, utilizing the strangeness of these sort of bugs. You can take these advantages. It's always cool to see bugs being used in games. Like the the best, I think, analogy for Brood War that works really, really well is like Super Smash Brothers Melee, and like how cool it is to do things like wave dash and that type of stuff. That it adds so much to the enjoyment of not only watching but also playing the game. Is like you're this is not something that the developers intended, but it's a really interesting way a skill expression from an emergent um, strategy or an emergent mechanic that was never intended by the developers, but makes it really cool. Something like, for example, Team Fortress 2, like rocket jumping around the map, that type of stuff. These are types of analogies that can be used for something like Brood Wars, like these strange extra things that come out. I'm not super against things like you were saying, like making things a little bit more smooth, like allowing turrets to be built in a mineral line, that type of stuff. I like that. I actually think that that would be helpful, but the thing is, I would never want to allow Blizzard to touch my game because they always mess it up. So like that's the problem, is that yeah, those things sound good, and maybe they could theoretically change some of those things to make it a little bit more accessible, like you said, like accessible and easier to play. Maybe a little bit would even make it more fun if you could just get things to build sometimes, like a little bit less frustrating. Would be nice, but we just can't let them touch it because it's too perfect the way it is, and we just know that they're gonna throw a complete wrench into things, and who knows what could happen.
Yeah, it's good to describe it that way. It's so perfect the way it is, insofar as if like you have to be in pursuit of a more perfect game in order to really do something, and you have to not just say that you are, but actually demonstrate that you have the capacity to. Like, I would
Mhm.
want whoever is thinking about making, like, if somebody was to say, it was announced tomorrow that there's going to be a patch for Brood War, whoever's authoring that patch, whatever people are involved, I would want to see their credentials. Oops. I would want to see their credentials. I would want to tell them, absolutely, you cannot just touch this game and, like, unless you've shown me, like, okay, you understand, like, the analogy of Chesterton's fence, it's there for a reason. Removing it is going to have consequences you can't foresee. What is your plan about those things, and how measured are your approaches? And that kind of thing to me is like, it does feel like people move away from what Brood War had at their own peril almost. It's like, well, you might make a
Mm,
game that's like, much more smooth to play and satisfying and interesting, but you might also make a game where like the difference between a good player and a great player is not nearly as pronounced as it is in Brood War. And that to me is
mm,
where the magic happens. Like I've often talked about skill floor versus skill ceiling in some of these talks, and I've talked about how like, yeah, you want to be able to have like a new player and a bad player and a good player and a great player all be differentiated. But I really think the rubber meets the road between good and great. Like the absolute
yeah.
top players and the players who are just coming up, the players who've only put in a year or two of dedicated practice and been to the only 2 or 3 ASLs in their career. Yeah, those level of players are like the good player in this analogy, even though they're like way better than most people. But like the great players, the truly excellent ones, the ones that can win ASLs or make deep finishes, the differences between those guys and the people who've only made it a couple of times is actually massive in many respects. And I feel like being able to differentiate between that is like that's where you can get into the really like good stuff. That's the secret sauce of designing a game that is meant to be competitive. And it's almost weird, right? Because I don't think anybody would say if they looked at how Brood War was designed and made, the environment, it wasn't like they could ever foresee any of this. They definitely didn't think to themselves, yeah, we're going to make a game that's going to like take off and still be played 25 years later and be played competitively at that. Like they could not foresee any of this stuff.
No.
But the cool things that you see is that like, even though there's certain aspects of the game that I just disagree with, like the randomness, like the fact that there's a 1 in 256 chance to miss any attack. Like I think that's silly, and I know that games have been influenced, if not outright decided by that, because it's just the law of values. Like you're going to get enough games where that happened. I saw this really funny image posted to the Brood War subreddit at some point, which was a tank underneath a tree getting missed 6 times in a row or something, right? And it's like it's the same
Mm,
misadvantage or same mischances up a cliff, and it's like and then also the fact that the ramps are all kind of jank and like you can actually lose vision or cliff advantage if you're on a right spot on the ramp and stuff sometimes if it's like a north ramp.
yeah.
And so it's like little things like that. Like I think it's very clear to say that you shouldn't be deciding like professional matches, maybe as a result, professional careers. You shouldn't be influencing these things through randomness or like you can have random spawns because that's like before any inputs have been put into the game. But if it's like, oh,
Hmm.
the game decides that I miss, that doesn't feel very satisfying. So I think it's like most people would probably come around to that, even if they think there might be some like nice, like fun factor of like missing. Cause I've heard that argument before. It's like, oh, it's just more fun if it's random. But like, we're not here, we're here to have fun ideally, but we're mostly also here for competitive integrity. And so like, I
Yeah.
think most people would come around to that. And maybe most people would even come around to like what you were saying with the building the missile turret and the mineral line. I do think that adds something where it's just like let a little bit you can focus on more interesting decisions basically is like the argument that I would
Yeah.
make. The same thing is like moving your units up a ramp. Like it's not necessarily the most interesting of decisions to babysit things, but I also recognize that I mean, if you're going to be changing stuff, are you only changing the randomness? Are you only improving those kinds of things? Like, what else are you
Mm.
going to change along the way? Like you were saying with worrying about what Blizzard would do. But also, the second point that I would make is like even the things that I think are good to change, like making it so that units move up a ramp better, or making it so that you can build a structure in the mineral line. Some of these things I've myself done in my work. It's like even though I've made that decision, I can still recognize that, wait, there might be a situation here where like making the game easier in this way actually makes it like worse in some fundamental way. Do you have thoughts on like maybe it could be specific mechanics that you've seen in other RTS games that you think maybe fit this bill, but do you have thoughts in situations where like some games have not really learned the right lessons from Brood War? Like it's not necessarily that we're saying it has to be just as jank or sort of finicky, but it should still be difficult. And I feel like there hasn't really been a game that I've played that has instituted or instantiated that difficulty while also smoothing out all of the sort of quality of life things that people get sort of rub up against negatively when it comes to Brood War.
I think that's like the $1 million question. Like, how do you take the grittiness and difficulty of Brood War and then put it into a game that also has like more smoothness as well, like something that can be palatable as a modern new game? That's really really hard to do. I don't know if there's a good answer. Really, I feel like um, the best thing that you can do as a new developer, if you're making an RTS, is just try to make the game as fun as possible without considering competitive play. I think that's probably the number one thing I would say, because that's what was done by the Blizzard team. Like, they didn't even think of competitive play at all when they were making the game. They were just making the units as cool and interesting to use as possible. You know, these insanely broken spells that they threw into the game, the crazy strong mechanics that just haven't really been shown anywhere else. I don't think, like, where even StarCraft 2, even, you know, these new RTSs that are coming out, where are the insanely broken mechanics, the ones that can completely change the game like that? You know, you get that unit and everything changes. Kind of like for example, like a defiler, right? If you have a defiler in Brood War, it changes the entire way that Terran or Protoss have to play, and it's instant. But uh, you know, those type of things don't really exist. It's like, okay, well, we just kind of play around it, you know, like, oh, we just kind of avoid it, or we have a counter unit that's specifically designed to counter that thing, which is very I don't know. I think that takes away from the fun and the sort of the interesting value of those things. Like, there's builds that, well, we're just gonna rush to that thing, right? And then, oh, that becomes way too powerful. So now we need something to counter that, so that they throw something in. That's where the live service comes in. And I think that if you really want to make a great game, you make something that is just fun and very, very, like, stylistic, right? And then you just allow the pro players to play with it for a good amount of time without doing any changes aside from map changes. What we've learned from Brood War is just changing the map, seeing what we can do to alter things and make strategies weaker simply by changing the design of the map. And then later, if, you know, we're actually losing players and we are you know, seeing only one race getting played, or only one faction getting played, or, you know, only one strategy getting played for a long period of time, maybe we consider changing something seriously. But I think that people they move too fast. The developers move too fast to change things, and they build units with a very specific purpose in mind, and then they provide counters for the purposes, you know, the strategies that they think up. It's a little bit like they're doing everything for the player, which
Yes.
doesn't really feel good.
No, when you said that there's like a counter unit, you first brought that up. The first thing that I thought of is like the idea of a hard counter system where it's like, oh, rock beats, you know, scissors beats paper or whatever, like that sort of uh, redundancy in some ways. If it's like, yeah, hey, player, don't worry, you don't have to do any thinking, just build this unit if you see that unit. And it's like, obviously,
Right.
it's a little bit more complicated than that in practice, but a lot of
Mhm.
the time, taking away the thinking part of, or the strategic part of like what my composition should look like, I always believe that compositions were the bread and butter of a good RTS. It's like, what, it's not just that I have this one unit that I've made a lot of. It's that I have, you know, many different units. I'm piecing together parts of the all of the different tech tree. Like, that's the most thematically satisfying and fun aspect. That really, like, going back to your point about fun over competitive integrity or focus, is like, yeah, I'd ever, you know, I have thought about it, but I haven't thought about it in a while. And you made me sort of, you jogged that memory in my head. It's like, absolutely, Blizzard focused on making a game, and then in StarCraft 2 they focused on making an esport, right? And they're two different
Mhm.
things in many ways. Even though you need
Yes.
the game to be an esport, you know, rather, you need, in order to be an esport, you need to have a game first. But it's like they focus more on that. Like, I always joked, we have this, we always call the Zelnaga towers, the watchtowers, they're the esports towers, because it's like you just put that there so there's something to fight over in the middle of the map. Like, it's not
Right.
necessarily the most well thought out thing, and I guess now they've kind of evolved their map design to maybe take that into account more. But when it was first there in Wings of Liberty, it was like, oh, this is just like one of those, you know, forced interactions, if you will, instead of, you know, having a more organic thing like, there's just some bases to fight over, or what have you. It's like, no, here's this watchtower. Then if you put a unit there and there's no other unit there, then you're good. And so it just felt like a little call and responsey in that respect. It's very similar to the hard counter thing. It's like, And actually, I mean, maybe you have some thought. I don't know if you've been paying attention to any of the games that have started to come out more recently, but in Stormgate, I haven't watched too much of it, but I've seen that the Vanguard faction starts with a dog, and I always thought like, oh, starting with the dog, especially since it can attack, means that you are basically saying to a player who's trying to be competitive in any way that you are forced to use this dog to harass the enemy worker. Like if it's a not a mirror matchup and they don't have a defender unit, then you have to use this free harassment and scouting unit. Otherwise, you're behind where you could be relatively to it, right? And so it's like
Mm.
you're basically putting this thing in. It's not a choice that I made the dog unit. It's like, oh, I spawn with it. Okay, now I can use it. And if I don't use it for that purpose, if I don't like, sort of like how in StarCraft 2, if you don't take the Reaper and damage the like force out like a canceled spore crawler and try to kill a drone in a TVZ, it's like, oh, okay, well if I didn't do that, then I'm a little bit behind where I could be, and so it's like it gets a little bit too like solved almost instantaneously for me. Do you have any thoughts on that, or even just the games that have been coming out more recently? Like I've seen Stormgate and Zero Space and some other titles that have been trying to make a splash, but it almost feels like maybe they're going the same route of like focusing a bit more on the esport before the game part.
Yeah, and uh, I think the early game is being removed from a lot of these
Yes.
different
Yeah.
RTSs. It was super obvious in StarCraft 2 when they went to like 12 workers right off the bat, and they took away because there's too much downtime at the beginning of the game, like that extra 15 seconds or 30 seconds of making workers in the early game was too boring for them or something. They wanted to like, let's go, let's get to the next game. You know what I mean? It's just a little like there's some interesting decisions that can be made there. Like we can see some really cool like early game stuff. Now, like in Brood War, it's very typical that we're gonna go to macro where the first like minute and a half of every game is just nothing but building workers, right? But there's still that potential. There's still that option to do something different, right? You could pull out something different. You could go for an earlier scout, or you could not scout. Whereas now in the newer RTSs, they're following more of the StarCraft 2 approach, where it's like, okay, the early game, we've set it out for you. This is what's going to happen, and there's not any room for creativity in the early game. There's not any room for risk and reward in the early game either. It's just you follow these set of rules, and we're going to get into the mid game basically, which is a little bit frustrating to see. It feels like they haven't really learned from Brood War at all.
Or even from StarCraft 2 for that matter, which is a game that they're emulating a bit more. I would say, just like I'm trying to learn from things that could be better in Brood War, despite thinking it's the best RTS out there, like that doesn't mean that
Mm,
it couldn't be improved upon. It means it's hard, right, to do that.
sure.
Designing a better Brood War is like the designer version of playing Brood War. It's a really hard thing to do, right? And so
Yeah.
when you're thinking about it like that, it makes sense to try to look for better things, better angles. Even if you think StarCraft 2 is really good, which a lot of these designers for Stormgate and other games have said that they do, if they're taking cues from that you want to learn from the failures. And sometimes they reference things like, I don't know, it almost feels like they're playing politics a little bit, because if they say too much about how StarCraft 2
Right.
really failed to do this thing better, then maybe all the people who are hoping it's the next StarCraft 2 are going to be like, wait, you can't badmouth the game that I like, or I don't know what they're doing exactly. But it feels like they're,
Yeah.
treating it with kid gloves a bit. And then even if that's not the case and they just have like a very surface level analysis, that doesn't bode well for, like, you want deep meaty analysis for the game design from the designers of this game. You want them to be able to say, here's what StarCraft 2 did that we like, and here's what we think could be improved upon. But actually, in some ways, they're going further than StarCraft 2 did for the removal of the early game, as you're pointing out. And in StarCraft 2, sometimes you drop your first expansion at like 50 seconds, right? And so it's like,
Right.
it's a very fast paced situation where, yeah,
Mm,
the early game basically exists as like a quick buffer for you to introduce the players before the mid game starts. Almost like if you're on the
right.
broadcast side, that's almost what it feels like to me. And so I know that there's definitely push and pull there. Like you can see some silly cheese in the early stages, but it definitely feels like if you had more, I guess, yeah, if you had more choices instead of things that were just chosen for you, like, I think Brood War would suffer the same kind of result if you started with 8 workers instead of 4. Like if you double the worker count that we currently have for Brood War, then I think you'd end up seeing kind of the same thing. It's like, oh, okay, well, the economy spikes up faster. You'd probably still have decent early stage things that you can do because the overall pace is slower than StarCraft 2, but I still
Hmm.
think you would lose out on something that is valuable. When you're thinking about like what the players can do and what they can choose to do in the early stages of the game that can set them apart. And that's where it comes back to like, despite the game being so difficult, or maybe in part because of the game being so difficult, it feels like we can have very distinct play styles between the different players who play, even if they're playing the same race, even if they're allegedly playing the same style. Obviously, some of the players that have come in very recently for Terran have done like really crazy drop antics and stuff. And it's like been really surprising there at the top pro level where, you know, people have said, oh yeah, he's bringing the StarCraft 2 style back to Brood War and stuff like that. And so that's cool to see because it's like, oh, there's, you know, very different angles that you can do and maybe people aren't doing, right? Going back to our topics about meta, maybe it's just an underdeveloped aspect of the meta where people haven't necessarily thought about it, or maybe just because it's unconventional, it catches people off guard. But either way, you can have stuff like that that can succeed even at the highest level that is very obviously different, even to a layman observer who's watching, you know, and they've seen a couple, like maybe 10 games of TVT, and then they see this game and it's like, whoa, that guy's doing it way differently. Like, that's crazy. And so I feel like that is what you start to sacrifice if you get rid of things like the early game, or if you try to like automate the decision making, which is sort of like hard counters where it's like, oh yeah, just build this in response to that. And it kind of goes back to trying to make it fun versus trying to make it a competitive esport discipline or whatever. It's like, it makes sense to make it, if you're in esports, if you're trying to do an esports focus, it makes sense to go for an approach where you're designing these competitive units that can fight back and forth. But it doesn't really make sense if you're trying to design like a cool game where the unit is thematically interesting, where you have a situation where like, here's my unit that casts this ridiculously powerful spell, and you're asking the other players, how can I respond to this? Instead of just saying, oh, here's how you respond to it, right? And that's sort of like what it gets to me as far as like the unit design, but also like the decision making to remove the early stages or fast forward through the early stages. I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on unit design in Brood War more than just you brought up the Defiler, but for me it's like, despite the units being kind of jank and not always listening to you, it does feel like individual units in Brood War make such a difference compared to individual units in other games.
Yeah, it definitely, for sure. And I'm kind of, this is kind of popping into my head right now. Like, do you feel that the newer games are also a lot faster than Brood War as well? Like the speed seems to be getting faster in my head. Like things are going faster and faster, and I feel like that is the source of a lot of the difficulty that players that commented on, like from the StarCraft 2 side, commented on my video was like, oh no, StarCraft 2 is way harder. Look at how much faster it is. You know, it's so much quicker. The decision making, the reaction speed of the players has to be so much better than the players in Brood War. But personally, it's very interesting that that's the decision that they make, is to go with like the speed aspect when they're trying to make an esport where the viewer is actually really, really important. I think that Brood War does that better. They have like it has a slower pace, and the viewer actually gets a better experience because they can see the fight unfolding and we can watch the players making their movements, whereas when in these newer games where you've got like faster moves and, you know, quicker reaction speed, you're barely even seeing them. You know, they're just task switching so fast, they're barely able to comprehend what's actually going on in the moment. And the skill expression is so quick that you barely get to see any actual movement.
And there's not even that much room for broadcasters, I feel like, to step in and say, "Oh, here's what they're thinking," or "Here's what's happening." Whereas if the combat pacing is a bit slower, which maybe it looks like it is in Stormgate, but I haven't watched enough to really know. But definitely, like the overall rate of scale up is much faster in that game, and so that's to your point about games getting faster. I do think that it's like a tactic people are using for the design, is like, look how fast we are, look how fast you can be. But I think it's a lot more about, like, again, the compositions, the strategy. Like in our game, we've got an average of 45 to 50 units per race, which is a crazy number for most people, but it's like, that's what the game is about. It's like building a composition of many different units and trying to use them all to, you know, good ideas. And then you compare that to like what is the way that a good player plays well in, you know, StarCraft 2 or maybe a Stormgate forthcoming, if as we get it more figured out. It's definitely more about speed. And it's like, because we solved the strategic layer, like, you know, not completely, but like you probably have a good idea, a good understanding of what your build should be, what your composition should be. The longer the game goes on, the more certain you are of what the meta is, for what the meta response is for that. Whereas in Brood War, it's more like, and ideally in our games as well, it's like the idea should be, scout my opponent, understand what they're doing. I should have time to do all of those things, right? Because if it's too fast, then you don't have time, like
Hmm.
you were saying. And then I should mount a response, create a response, and then deploy that. And that should be like the flow of the game, is because then my opponent is going to do the same thing back to me unless my attack kills him. And so that is sort of like a more idealized version, a more fun version. Forget about competitive, but more fun version of an
Hmm.
RTS. And what do you reckon about that sort of thing? Because I think what Brood War's lower speed does allow for is the strategic decision making, and also in some ways like handling all the jank as well. That can shine through as a skill for Brood War players. Whereas in StarCraft 2, I think the strategic decision making is more minimized, while the reaction times are more like the thing that gates you a lot of the time.
I think you put that into words pretty well there. Honestly, I didn't really think about it um, as much in that way. I was thinking about it more from a viewer
Oh
perspective.
yeah,
But yeah,
sure.
the interaction back and forth between the players of scouting and figuring out what's coming, and then reacting, and then they're reacting to what your reaction is. That does get limited by the speed, I think, and that does take something out of the game. So yeah, I hope that developers in the future kind of realize that um, the RTS doesn't need to be a million miles a minute, where there's 10 different things going on at all times, and the casters don't even have a second to breathe because they're constantly explaining what's happening, and um, there's no time for downtime. Like it is fun. It's nice to have a little bit of downtime where we can elaborate on what the strategy is and kind of uh, think about what is going to be coming next, and the players have that time as well, and they can kind of think about what's the next strategy, and then when things get really fast and when the players start to do lots of things at the same time, like they're multitasking around the map and hitting different things at the same time, it's actually really cool because it's not like that every single game. So it's like an exciting thing, whereas in StarCraft 2 it's like, oh, or Stormgate or whatever, it's like everywhere on the map is getting hit at the same time all the time. It's not really that uh, you know amazing or interesting. Whereas handling even two dropships at the same time in Brood War is like, wow, you're really hitting that multitasking. You're really taxing the other player. But that's just par for the course in StarCraft 2. If you're not doing that, like you're way behind. You're losing the game.
And I think that's the, going back to the idea of, oh, making the army movement better and more smoother, and making the game like operate more smoothly. What you run the risk of is like making it too easy, which it sounds weird to say, because like people are just going to say, of course
Hmm.
you want it to be good and smooth and easy to control your army, but like, is it really? Of course, like, do you really want that? Because maybe the result is it's super easy to do that, everybody does that, the game becomes a lot more chaotic and harder to follow. And you brought up viewers. I think it's a great opportunity for us to talk about like the broadcasting angle of this, because we both have a little bit. You've got more experience than I do, but we both have a little bit of experience sort of trying to present RTS ideas to a public through casting and stuff. And for me, it's like the biggest hurdle that Brood War has to cover is not one of pacing, like StarCraft 2 seems to have, and what like a lot of other games are probably going to have. It's not one of like, I don't get enough time to sort of explain like the nuances. Maybe there aren't that many nuances to explain or whatever. There's plenty of nuance in Brood War. It's almost like
Hmm.
you have to find a way to communicate some of the more individual things, like if there's some bugs that are used, or some like exploits, if you want to call them that, like the worker decollision to like pop a vulture over on Neo Dark Origin, and like the, where that mineral field is, like you can attack the drones and stuff in TVZ. It's like, okay, cool, this is like a really pocket strategy, and like you can talk about it, but you have to kind of explain, like, if you want to explain it thoroughly, you have to explain it very like step by step. Whereas I do think that a lot of what I've noticed, and maybe you can speak to your own style of casting in this too, is that like sometimes you might just want to say, I'm going to assume you understand like enough about this that I can just simply comment on how, like, I don't need to be super in depth. I can just simply say on a surface level, yeah, he's going to, mineral walk this vulture over. And I can trust that like the viewer has like listened to that enough. But if you're trying to communicate these to maybe first timers, or maybe again, be a bit more like accessible, broadly speaking, but not in a cursed way, in like an actual useful way where you're presenting the idea better, it's like, how can we as casters, what are some tactics that you've used in the past to like maybe try to explain those ideas in a more level field, so that now everybody who's listening can think, okay, now I know that information for the future?
Ooh, that's tough. I constantly walking this line of wanting to be more accessible to newer viewers, but also not wanting to alienate the viewers who have been there for 20 years, Like there's a lot of people who've been watching this game for so long. They know all this stuff. They don't want to be talked down to, It sounds um you have to kind of preface every time you say something, when you're going to explain something like that. Like, all right, for newer players, if you've never seen this strategy before, this is what you're going to do, right? Because, I mean, I'm a long time viewer of Brood War as well, and if the caster is going to explain something that I've seen 1,000, 100,000 times, I'm just gonna roll my eyes, right? So I really do have to kind of tread lightly and like explain things here and there, kind of throw in a little bit of extra commentary. I try to focus on things that maybe people who haven't watched, or who have watched for a long time, but who haven't played really heavily, might be interested in. For example, like mineral optimizations. Sometimes I throw that type of commentary in where at the beginning of the game, there's lots of time. I can explain like, oh, this patch, if you're hitting, return minerals at this time, you're going to get a mineral boost, and look at the pro players mineral boosting and doing this type of thing, and that type of thing is nice. Or the nuance of dropping a reaver in between the tank shots, tanking with the zealots or something like that. Those are nice little things to throw in, but I I have a deep empathy for people who have been watching for a very long time, and I don't want to talk down to them or make them roll their eyes when they watch my cast. I want to excite them with new strategies and new explanations rather than the old ones, the old and tired ones that's been going on. And I know that's not great for new players, or for new viewers, but I mean, getting into Brood War is it's a task. It's going to take a lot of time. You can't just show up for one cast and just be completely, you know, totally introduced. You got to take a lot of time to learn the game.
And yeah, that's interesting. In some ways, it's a great filter for people coming in, because you kind of get the feeling that if somebody's sticking around for a while, they probably are interested enough to like put up with maybe not knowing all of the details, or what have you, and
Hmm.
not fully grasping the totality of the game. And so I think that helps, because it's like, oh wait, you're actually going to stick around and find out. Okay, well, like, not that we're gatekeeping the knowledge, but it's just like, hey, we're
Hmm.
focused on like what's in front of us. We're going to present this, in a maybe a matter of fact way. And there's, I think about this from like presenting characters in a story as well. Like, when I'm trying to do something like that, if I'm presenting information matter of factly, like I say something and then the characters are just like, yeah, okay, that's normal. And like, just by saying, very reacting very matter of factly, then that that's normal. Whereas like, so if you can kind of intuit it based on like how the caster is reacting to something. It's like one of the recent Artosis casts actually has the Neo Dark Origin example where a Mineral Walk Vulture happens, and he's just like, yeah, here's a gun, here it is. He just points at it and he zooms in on it and he's like, yep, there we go, all right, perfect, and then like moves on. And so it's like, okay, that this is like something that pros just know how to do. Then like you can kind of intuit that even if you don't know the exact mechanism, you at least understand like how it's happening. So I guess maybe I'm thinking more from a new viewer perspective, because I'm in my own little bubble within a bubble, which is a niche within a niche of like trying to work on this prototype and present the information out there. And I've been thinking about like, man, how would I even say? Because like, not only is the Brood War's own mechanics can be a bit of a mystery. It's like, well, then we've added this layer on top, and so it's like, okay, how do we like try to parse that information? But I think it makes sense what you're saying about trying to cater towards the audience that well, basically yourself, right? The hardcore who's watched
Hmm.
for hundreds of thousands of times this sort of interaction happen, has seen so many situations. I guess maybe I would call your attention to like a hypothetical example, something like what Snow did in ASL recently, where he was able to trigger like a spider mine detonation with a reaver drop and then pick up the reaver without
Hmm.
taking any damage. It's like such a
Yeah.
flex. It's so precise what you have to do with that most people maybe
Yes.
didn't even know that maybe that was their first time seeing that, even if they watched 100 hours or 1,000 hours of Brood War. And so
Right.
like I feel like maybe in that situation it makes a bit more sense to go a little bit more hype. What do you think about stuff like that? Like when you can point to like a specific interaction. You talked about mineral boosting, but this is like in the middle of battle as well, so you can really get hyped for something like this. How would you try to sort of present stuff like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. You want to explain those type of little nuances like that. That's one of those one in a thousand or 10,000 games things that obviously, even if the viewer's seen it before, they don't mind hearing another explanation of why it happened. I'm talking about things like what's a good one, like hmm, for example, like stacking mutalisks or something like that. Like, oh, they're putting a overlord in the mutalisk bunch, so and it's far away. So how it works is that the mutalisk stack because they think that the one unit is really far away, and it pulls them in a weird direction. So those type of things that we see every single game, I try to avoid explaining those things, but those like one in a 10,000. Those are great learning moments for the audience. Even if you've seen it before, it's nice to hear the explanation. So definitely lean into those ones and just try to avoid the things that happen all the time.
Sounds about right. Yeah, it's interesting because, especially if it is something that happens all the time, I think with enough time spent watching, like you were saying, people are just going to pick up that stuff. Like they're going to understand this is how Zerg attack with the mute is. Like maybe if they're trying to replicate it in their own play, it's a bit different. But I kind of
Hmm.
get the impression that Brood War is watched more than it is played in some ways. Like there's maybe
Oh
more
yeah.
people that watch it than play it, especially at the level that we're talking about when we're casting. That's a obvious like foregone conclusion. But it does feel like I certainly watch Brood War a lot more than I play it, right? And so, like, if I'm going from my own example, it definitely feels like I know a lot more people that might check out ASL or stuff like that, and maybe they're not as interested in booting it up themselves to go for ladder because maybe it's too hard for them, or maybe it requires too much of the focus or whatever. But they can still appreciate it because they played it in the past. They can appreciate the high level gameplay. So maybe there's that too, where it's like, okay, you don't have to worry too much about making it replicable for the people who are trying to play themselves. Because that's another thing I've noticed with competitive casting is that sometimes you will get people who are like, really trying to push the angle of, hey, talk about this in the context of, in your own games. And I think maybe that kind of comes from MOBAs, actually. It's like when you see
Mhm.
a champion be used in a certain context or a hero be used in a certain context or a comp, or even like the really silly example, there was like lane swapping in one meta for League of Legends Worlds, and or one of the events anyway. And I remember thinking to myself like, oh yeah, I should just do that with my buddy and in my team or whatever, like my just group of friends. And it's like little stuff like that. Like that's a little bit more surface level. And of course, we got dumpstered if anybody wants to know, because we didn't understand what we were doing. But that's the kind of thing. It's like that's more casual. Whereas in the case of Brood War, it's a lot more like, oh shit, there's like way more stuff going on here that I need to know before I can replicate that.
Yeah, I mean, if you see something happen in ASL, go on the ladder the next day, you'll probably see it. Something that worked really well, you're gonna see it on the ladder because everyone's trying to replicate those guys. Everyone's watching, and yeah, definitely way more people are watching than are playing. It's really hard to get anybody to play Brood War. Trying to do like a fan event or something like that. Like, hey, well, let's all play like a UMS map together for celebrating. For example, I think it was like 3,000 subs or something. I tried to put together like 8 players to do a UMS, and I got like 2 people together. Like nobody had the game. Nobody has the game. So or they don't, maybe they have it, but they don't have it installed or whatever. They just don't have time. A lot of people who are fans of Brood War are older than 30, maybe like 25 to 40 years old is like the main portion of people who are watching, and they're probably just watching um, because they've watched for years and years and they enjoy the game, but they don't really have time to play. So I think that's a really common theme for Brood War fans. And yeah, maybe you're kind of right with saying that they don't necessarily need an explanation so that they can learn how to play, but just so that they can be more like informed as a viewer to really enjoy what's actually happening on the game and kind of like respect it and understand it on a fundamental level of how difficult it is. Like what they're, of course, they're never going to really understand how difficult it is because they're not doing it, but they can kind of see like, oh wow, that is really finely timed, him picking up that reaver at that time, or like that's really well played, like the way that he was dodging that ability or that skill, or moving that unit. It's like they, once they kind of feel the respect, they understand what it takes to do that thing. then they can respect it more, and then they can get like a deeper enjoyment out of watching players actually pull it off.
Yeah. So this is an interesting. It makes me think of like, thinking about ways to improve. We've talked a little bit about like maybe danced around ideas of how to improve Brood War. But one thing I think we could probably do is improve the spectator experience. And I
Mm.
mean, I say this hypothetically because it would require code level changes, which I don't think anybody's going to make. But I was thinking about things like showing the players selection circles so that you see which units they're
Hmm.
actually controlling. Definitely, I feel like what we got with the remaster was showing their cameras and their camera positions. That was like really good for live games. I think putting that into replays would be an easy feature since you're already syncing the data anyway, so you can just put that into replays. These are stuff that we've done in our realm, and I'm thinking about like if I were to take like quality of life things for the spectator and apply them to the live viewers or for Brood War or for ASL for any of these like broadcasts, I feel like those would be things that would help in players be more or viewers be more informed about what they're actually seeing because they can see like,
Hmm.
oh, those units don't have a selection circle under them. That means that he's not controlling them. They're just on autopilot attack moving somewhere. And so it's like it helps you understand like, wait, why did he just lose that stack of bio off into the third base? Oh, it's because he wasn't controlling it, right? Like, so if we pan over there and we see
Right.
that he's not there, you can kind of intuit that based on the camera positions, but still, it's like it can help to show exactly what the players are doing. I think it would also help indicate like, whoa, these guys are really fast actually. Like they're clicking all over them.
Yeah.
Like you'd actually be able to see the APM instead of it just being a number. You'd be able to see it actuated
Yes.
in the game. Have you been thinking about ways to improve the spectator or any things that have come to mind now that I bring that topic up? Is like if we had this, it would be really nice. Like anything that you personally long for when you're casting.
Not at all, but I love your ideas.
Oh, okay,
That
cool.
would be really, really cool, actually, to see the selection circles. I would love to have that as a feature. Um, no, I'm not thinking actively about ways that I'd like to improve Brood War. We're like we're so far in at this point. It's never going to go away, and it's just the way that it is. So, um, obviously from a developer's perspective, that those are super interesting questions to think about, but it's not something that I'm actively thinking about myself, but that would be awesome. That would be really cool to see. You would, like you said, be actually able to witness the APM, and it would be really cool to see, how beautiful the micro with how insane the micro is with someone like Snow, controlling their Reaver and everything, and they're doing other things. They're not actually controlling it the whole time. He's like jumping back and forth between his base and the Reaver while doing this insane micro trick is like, oh my god, that's really, really impressive. It would be really cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, there was this old clip before the remaster days, so we didn't even have camera positions, and it,
Hmm.
it was a Protoss player. I'm blanking on the name. He was clearing mines, and while he was clearing mines, without
Bisu.
oh yeah, okay, so it's
Yeah.
Bisu's Dragoon micro, and he orders a probe in the middle of it, and it's like the balls on you, man, to do that because it's
Yeah.
such like a tight timing where if he messes up, like he could just lose all of his pressure in the early game, and Terran can run free for that stage. And so it's actually really tight, but like we had to wait for a first person view or maybe somebody in a replay or something to see like what was going on in that match because we didn't have the tools in the moment at the time. So like even though it was already very impressive that he was clearing it with the Dragoons, it's like whoa, it's actually more impressive than we thought because of what he was able to do in the same time and multitasking, right? Like you were saying with Snow's example. So I do think being able to better present that information to the player or to the viewer is as like a big boon, and it's definitely more stuff for the casters to talk about. Another thing I actually did recently was I implemented a thing where it just pings the mini map when combat happens off screen
Hmm.
for the person who's watching live or in a viewer, and obviously it doesn't do any of these pings for that for when you're in the player seat, but when you're in the spectator seat, if you will, that's sort of like a system that we have. We also have it when you put down like a text structure, which is more uniform in our game, but it would be almost like if I guess in StarCraft 2 they have this like spectator thing where like when medevacs get loaded up or a drop gets loaded up, it like kind of minimap pings you to indicate that.
Mm.
I feel like maybe that's a little bit too much noise for the spectator, but the idea of like being able to indicate to the observer, to the caster, you've got really good ASL observers and stuff, and you get really good at observing at a pro level when you understand the meta of like what you can expect. So it's not necessarily a problem that Brood War has right now, but I feel like you know I guess, there's the perennial complaint about like people missing drops or whatever. And it's like, well, hey, if there's, a ping whenever there's combat that you're not currently looking at, and it's, infrequent enough that it's not like constant noise, but it's just like, oh, hey, there's action over here. Just like what happens when you have your own units under attack in a game that you're playing. I feel like stuff like that could also be a nice improvement too. So I've been thinking about that. I just figured I would pick your brains about stuff because it's like, we think about we get stuck in with the like what we understand Brood War to be and what we understand the spectator and casting experience to be, and even the tournament experience. Like I come from both a Brood War and a Counter-Strike background when it comes to watching competitive players play, and in Counter-Strike, we've experimented with so many different tournament formats, and for ASL to have best of ones in the round of 24 feels really whack to me. I wanted to know what you think about this, because this is, in some ways, it's like, you shouldn't burn the sacred cow. I think ASL is still a really banger tournament. It just feels like it could be, like the fact that I always hear people say, it's really hard to win an ASL, even if you're supposed to win. Like it doesn't, I guess it's not setting up the tournament favorites very well, because it can be like, Jaedong eliminated in 2 best of ones or whatever. Like that feels really bad, right? Yeah. So like, how do you come down on the ASL format?
I'm a little disappointed that they changed it. They used to have it where the first 2, like, they would have, two best of ones, and the winners would have a best of 3, and the losers would have a best of 3, and then the decider was a best of 3. And I don't know why they changed it. It seems like that gave a lot more play and a lot of a better chance for the better players to rise to the top. So it is a little bit of a disappointing change. I wish they would bring it back. I don't see why they can't bring it back. Like, was it taking too long? They don't have enough time. They don't have enough stage time or something. I really have no idea why they decided to make that change. I think it does take away from the hype of the ASL. But honestly, what I was saying before is that the ASL really doesn't matter as much as a lot of players think anymore. For the Korean players, like the prize pool is really not that amazing. It's all about streaming, and really what the ASL is about these days is clout. You're trying to get yourself seen by the fans of Brood War, right? If you do really well in the ASL, you're going to rise to the top of the streaming charts, right? More people are going to be watching you. More people are going to be interested in your stream. You're going to get more invitations to different tournaments. You're going to get more invitations to, Pro League. These are money-making opportunities, and the Brood War streamers and pro gamers have become like little entrepreneurs since 25 years ago, right? They've grown up and they've become very good at making money off of what they do, whereas back in the day it used to be teenagers in their little team houses, completely broke and just trying to make their way in the world. But now they're grown up, they've got kids, they've got families, they're like making money. So really ASL is not as big of a deal as it was before, but I wish that they would just change it back. Why did they have to change it to best of ones? It's very silly.
Yeah, I mean, and it pulls back the curtain a little bit for ASL to not be considered as big from a prestige level, because you still want to be a Star League winner, right? But it's like, it's right. Very different than the OSL days, right? Or, it's like, it's a different situation now. And I mean, in some ways that's just a sign of the times, but in other ways, I do feel like it's a bit of a shame that the tournament can be so upset heavy to start with. And people have commented before that, like, even on a more cynical, like, broadcast number level, Jaedong going deep in the tournament means way more eyeballs, because he's just like he's a household name as far as RTS players are concerned. And so, like, that would be one example where it's like, even if you're thinking more so in the business sense and less so on the quality of the tournament sense, it's like, well, if he's good enough and he gets an opportunity with the best of 3 to show that he's more than just like one cheese away from being defeated or whatever. Like, you can see the argument in favor of or against or whatever the best of ones, and sure, maybe the arguments for it are like, I guess, extrinsic. It's like, oh yeah, we don't have enough time. Like, stuff that you were saying. It's like it's a very real concern for operating a tournament. But if I'm just like putting my fan visor on and I'm shutting out the industry side, I'm thinking, why'd you guys change this? This is just worse, right? And so that's sort of where it comes down for me, is like, I do feel like it could be better. But I'm also like, I'm the kind of guy that, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to tell ASL or anybody else, hey, every match has to be best of 7 because that's how we win. That's how we know for sure that somebody's like the better player.
Right.
You know, like that the number of games increasing in scope is like almost like a thematic thing of like, oh, it was best of 3 before, but now it's best of 5 to qualify or best of 7 or you know for the final and stuff. That's like, oh, this is your final challenge. Like you've climbed the mountain. I feel like that can be like a thematic thing. So
Hmm.
I don't think it all has to be that, but just best of ones, especially with the meta being what it is now, with how the players have developed it, where things can happen very aggressively in the early stages of the game. And I mean, everybody kind of knows everybody. Like you play against all these players, but I mean, I guess like all that needs to be said is that Queen didn't make it. So like you know that there's some instability, and I guess like concerns about whether or not the tournament format can be robust. I mean, Queen is like a very egregious case, and that was even in a best of 3 anyway. But like that's rough. Like it's really rough, and to lose out on people that are household names like him and of course Jaedong, just a best of ones does feel a little bit awkward. Mostly for like the storyline or history of the game. Like if I'm going to go on to Liquipedia later, I might not remember that. Oh yeah, this is the ASL best of 1 era. I might just look, oh, Jaedong finished in round of 24. Like okay, I guess he was
Hmm.
washed then or something. You know, like I might have like a very surface
Right.
level take, and so that would also be what I would be worried about. But I don't know. You obviously see a lot of pro players with the stuff that you're working on. And I actually wanted to ask you a little bit if you could talk to me about what you like most about the KCM series. The fact that you did talk to me before we started this that you wrapped up the most recent season. Like, what are you thinking about this particular project as it pertains to Brood War as a whole? Because it represents yet another thing that people can participate in that isn't directly related to ASL. Like we obviously see CNSL starting up recently. That's the Caster Muse Narok Star League, and the
Hmm.
fact that we've got the Race Survivor series too. There's a lot of StarCraft for people to watch that isn't directly related to like a LAN event on hallowed ground like the ASL studio and stuff, right? And so, what do you think if you had to like maybe elevator pitch KCM stuff? What would you say about like what is really cool about this event for you from your perspective?
Well, the event runs year round, so it's really nice to have that like in between content where ASL is, just 2 times per year. There's a big gap in time that um, we don't really get to see a lot of the players unless you're watching their streams. So it's very nice to have a event like the KCM. And what I love about the KCM and why I wanted to watch it and cast it in the first place was that I like to see the backstory of these players, right? I want to see how they're matching up in between the ASL seasons and how are they preparing, what are the strategies that are evolving, which players are coming up, which players are, falling off, which players are developing these new strategies and how are they being countered. These are like really interesting thoughts for me, and it's why I watch a lot of Brood War on the ladder as well because a lot of players play on barcode accounts to test out new strategies, and if we can find out who they are on their barcode accounts, we can kind of follow along their journey. For example, there's this amazing strategy that was utilized by TY in the a ladder game versus Shine, where he went for like a bio push. It was really he made the game look like he was doing a bio push. He was pushing out with Marines. He was building Marines constantly. He was threatening with them in the early game, like showing that he was planning to go for something like a 2 racks or that he had gone for, an early +1 or something. And he was, threatening to move across the map with his Marines like any bio player will do. At the same time, building a factory and putting out the speed vultures, and then right as the mutalisks fly in, he runs into your natural with speed vultures and hits you and kills all your drones. And then we watch that happen in a ladder game, and I said that this is TY's secret build. This is his like ace in the hole, and then he pulled it out in ASL and won a game with it. And I was like, this is why I watch these things. This is why I like watching these ladder games. This is why I like watching the KCMs because you get that backstory. You get to see that development happen.
Yeah, it's apotheosis, right? It's like, oh, I put through the effort to look through these games. I saw this really cool strategy. It gets pulled out on the highest of stages. Oh, I forget the Zerg player, but there was some guy who apparently was so tricky and finicky that he was like saving a build since 2009 that he deployed in like one of
Shine,
the.
yeah.
Oh, it was Shine. Okay, that's really funny that it
Yes.
happened versus him because it's the same kind of dynamic. Yeah, and it's like
Yeah.
just to think about stuff like that. Like, what? How do you come up with this stuff and keep it a secret so for so long? But yeah,
Yeah.
the barcode accounts, the whole like snakes. I guess it's like smoke and mirrors of like, oh wow, what's going to happen next. You can shed some light on that by watching some of these ladder battles that you have done casts of, and you can absolutely get like a little bit of a leg up there, which is why one of the many reasons why I think it's easy to recommend your channel and by recommending a lot of other matches. And so you would say then that the Race Survivor gives you another look, another layer of that. You get to sort of see the backstory and the narratives that are building around individual players, but in a context of like, oh, these guys are, they're not in an ASL right now, but you get this year-round fixture of here's Brood War, here's these players, they're definitely trying, they want the glory, they obviously want prize pool and stuff like that, but they also want
Mhm.
to practice up and be in shape in general, and so they're going to be trying new things. Do you generally see a lot more new things in Race Survivor than in some of the other events that you've casted?
Yeah, and you also get this interesting dynamic where you are in a team of the same race, right? All the Protoss players are together, all the Terran players are together, all of the Zerg players are together, and then they're communicating with each other and developing ideas about how to take down certain opponents, right? Like maybe right now, Best is insanely good, right? Best is like crushing everyone with a certain strategy. He's going for speed shuttles and he's hitting at this time and he's doing these specific things. And the Terran players come together as like a squad and they try to like dissect like what can we do to beat this guy, and they communicate between each other and they come up with an idea, and then one of them goes out to try and execute it. And it goes how it goes. Maybe they win, maybe they lose. And if they lose, then the next guy comes out and tries to execute it. And it's like, okay, well, how many Terran players can he beat in a row with all of them putting their brains together to try and figure out how to beat him? It's very interesting to see that, like, all right, we're all gonna like, mentally, put our heads together here and like think of a strategy. It's a different dynamic than, for instance, ASL, where you're just on your own trying to think it up. But again, well, you're not totally on your own, because a huge part of ASL that we don't see is all the practice partners that go into and helping people who are in the ASL, right? Whenever you watch an ASL, you can see the finalists or the semifinalists. They will thank their practice partners and they'll list them out as the people that they played with in order to prepare for those matches. And that's actually a huge part that you don't see, but it's more pronounced, I think, in the KCM, and it's cool. It's just fun. I enjoy it. I really like that aspect.
The team and cooperation aspect for me is also really cool because I think there's video games can get a bad rap. They can be seen as like trashy or just this thing that you waste your time with. And I feel like teaching players to aspire to greatness, teaching humans, if you want to use that instead of players, to be better at like cooperating with each other, at coming up with like good responses. And like even if you're playing 1v1 competitive, you still want to be a kind of person that the other player wants to continue playing with, like especially if they're a
Hmm.
good player. Like you want to be the kind of person that you don't want to be overly rambunctious or whatever. Toxic is the term that gets thrown around a lot. You don't want to be like bad mannered, right? Because you're gonna get more people who are interested in continuing to practice with you and improve. And like that is a life skill. Like if I know it sounds silly to say, but it's like no, you can actually learn a lot
Hmm.
of really valuable lessons or reinforce those lessons, even if it's not the only place that you're learning it for, by playing, games competitively and taking them seriously. And it's like, it's the opposite of what you would expect. It's like, no, the more time that you put into the right kinds of games or the right kinds of things, you're actually getting more value instead of it being more of like a time waster or whatever. So there's just a thought that popped into my head when you were talking about the practice partners, because it's true. Like they all earnestly thank their practice partners at the end of every winner's interview, even to get through the round of 24. We saw this earlier with people saying like, oh yeah, I really, thank shout out to this guy and that guy. And it's like, yeah, it's important because otherwise who knows where they would have wound up, without the practice,
Hmm.
without that, cooperation. And then the fact that you get to almost have that be part of the format, with the KCM Race Survivor stuff is like
Yeah.
really cool to see, because it's as the kills keep racking up with the one Protoss guy beating all the Terrans. It's like, whoa, like this guy's really on another level and he's figured out something, and like starts to become, can he be defeated? Can the other guys put their heads together, like you're saying? And that is like a narrative that doesn't have to be there, but it can evolve naturally out of the format. So that's really cool too. And that whole cooperation angle, which you don't normally get too much lip service paid to in a competitive 1v1 type game. It's more like,
Hmm.
oh, are you a good teammate in like a MOBA or an FPS or attack shooter or whatever? But
Right.
no, like you want to be a good teammate even in this context, right? Because you want to be able to practice up with your homies, so to speak. And so that's really cool. Definitely an aspect that you miss in the more, like you said, the ASL stuff, where you're only going to get little inklings of it if it's like practice partners, so to speak. So yeah, definitely a
Hmm.
really cool kind of thing. For me, I also think, looking at the way that the events have been running, and obviously your YouTube throughput has been pretty consistent in terms of the video uploads. You did reference earlier that you're planning another video. Do you have any other things that are in the pipeline that you want people to watch out for?
Um, well, that video is going to be coming out soon. I've been contacted about putting on a tournament as well. It's something that I've been aspiring to for a while, but haven't really had the funds or the funding to do so. But we've got someone who's interested in doing that. It's just a matter of putting it all together and getting the players together and setting up the actual tournament format and stuff like that. So that's still a long way down the road, but um, I'm very excited about this video, and I'm just enjoying the kind of limelight, the beauty of this kind of resurgence that's happened in Brood War over the past few years that I've been a part of, and that I've enjoyed the benefits of, and the just the as a viewer, it's been amazing as well. The seawall.gg that's come out recently, that website completely changed the game. All the cast, the Artosis cast, the Tasteless cast, the all the casters that are out there putting out tons of content all the time. Like you said, CNSL. There's the NSM that I got to cast recently. There's so many different Brood War sources of entertainment right now. It's kind of insane. The reason I started this channel, from the very beginning, was because I thought there wasn't enough Brood War content. I was getting tired of watching, just the ASL and then having a huge amount of downtime and occasionally watching streams. I thought that, we need to have some more English content out there because I was tired of watching, oh, this, KCM or these other tournaments that are only cast in Korean Ultimate Battle or whatever. It's we need more content out here if we want to keep this game going. So that's why I started the channel, and I feel like um not just through my own actions, but we've already achieved that goal. There's so much content out there at this point.
It's definitely a nice time to be a foreigner in the Brood War terms, and enjoying the content that's out there, enjoying the access into the players, even the Korean players that you get thanks to translators, obviously, like Jinjin's out there doing a lot of videos as
Mhm.
well, and also just the fact that we have so many ways to look into that thanks to Seawall, like you mentioned, is a great resource for people to be able to put two and two together as to whose barcode is this actually, and sort of pull the curtain back so you get to see a bit more details, like what you were, the example you gave with the vulture feint in TVZ. And so it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, there's absolutely things that you could, more things for you to appreciate if you want to go deeper than you ever have when it comes to Brood War. You can now, which is definitely really cool. And so I do have to thank you for helping to make that possible through your channel and through your efforts. I'm really looking forward to the tournament you're talking about, because having started to run much more lower scale ones myself, it's a big challenge, it's a big effort, but it's very satisfying even on my level. So with what you're talking about, I imagine the payoff will be even better. And just having more, I guess, like, content out there, and more tournaments and events and games presented to a wider audience is definitely something that's healthy for the game, which is always going to be near and dear to my heart, no matter what stuff I go on to make myself. So really appreciate that, and thank you for all of the efforts.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. It's always been just a passion project a letter of love to the game that I grew up with and I still enjoy. So it's just all fun, just all fun and games.
There it is, just all fun and games. Where can people find you? I know you got a Twitch channel you've been using more recently and stuff. As we come to the end of the interview, also hit us with any, we obviously covered a lot of ground. So if you have any closing thoughts that you want to leave us with, but definitely tell people where to find you.
You can find me at Twitch, Saiyan SC on Twitch, Saiyan KCM on YouTube. That's pretty much everywhere I'm active right now. Um, Yeah, I hope that ASL changes back. That's my last that's
Yep.
my last closing thought. I don't understand why the qualifiers are best of threes, all
Right.
best of threes, and then we have to watch best of ones in the round of 24. Make ASL great again, man. Turn it back.
There it is. There it is. That's something I can get behind. All right, man. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll be seeing you around.
Thank you.